Katie, my best friend, raised an eyebrow as we settled into the comfort of my small but cozy living room, which was surrounded by bookshelves filled with fantasy novels, a true indicator of my passion for reading and writing. "Are you sure about this, Jessica?" she asked cautiously. Exhaling deeply, I tucked a stray hair behind my ear. "About marrying Henry? Absolutely. It's his family that's more complicated, especially his mom," I admitted. Katie's skepticism was palpable. "Mrs. Holland, right?" she asked, to which I could only nod in agreement. Henry's mother, Mrs. Holland, was truly in a league of her own, constantly interfering and judging. And her involvement in our wedding plans had been overwhelming. Just as we broached the topic, the doorbell rang, and Mrs. Holland entered, her presence as commanding as ever. "Jessica, dear, we need to talk about your wedding dress," she announced without a preliminary greeting. Bracing myself, I inquired, "What about the dress, Mrs. Hollands?" She dismissed my choice with a wave of her hand. "The one you picked isn't suitable. I found the perfect one yesterday. It's slightly above your budget," she stated, her tone brooking no argument. "Slightly's?" I pressed, fearing her definition of slight. "It's double your budget, but it's worth every penny," she declared confidently. I shared a helpless look with Katie. "Mrs. Holland, I can't afford that," I protested. "Nonsense," she snapped. "It's your special day. You should cut corners elsewhere. This dress is essential." Feeling cornered, I reluctantly agreed, knowing it would be less troublesome than opposing her. The following day, we visited the bridal shop. The dress was indeed stunning, but the price tag was nauseating. As I tried it on, Mrs. Holland gushed over how fabulous I looked, sealing the deal herself. "It's settled then," she announced, clapping her hands joyously. "We'll take it." I hesitated due to the cost, but before I could speak, she interrupted, "Don't worry. Consider it my gift to you." A wave of relief washed over me. Perhaps I had misjudged her after all. Fast forward to the wedding day. The dress was a sensation, and I truly felt like royalty. However, when I approached Mrs. Holland later about the dress payment, she conveniently backtracked on her promise. "Jessica, dear, I never said I'd pay for the whole thing. I just helped you choose, that's all," she claimed, brushing off my shock. "You must have misunderstood. Anyway, it's done now. No use crying over spilled milk." Stunned and feeling deceived, I realized Katie's earlier caution was right. I should have been more vigilant. On another seemingly ordinary Thursday, I was in my home office, the smallest room in the house, surrounded by my writing materials. It was my sanctuary, or at least it was supposed to be. The tranquility was shattered by the doorbell. Mrs. Holland, true to form, had arrived unannounced, treating our home as if it were a public space. "Jessica, dear, I'm here," she declared from the living room, not even waiting for me to come to the door. Taking a deep breath, I braced myself and greeted her, trying to keep my tone pleasant. "Hi, Mrs. Holland." "Oh, there you are, hiding in your little room," she commented, looking around with disdain. "You really should get out more, dear." Forcing a smile, I replied, "I'm quite busy with my writing." "Writing, scripting," she dismissed, waving her hand. "You need to live a little." "Now, where's the remote?" As Mrs. Holland settled comfortably on my couch and flicked on the television, a surge of annoyance bubbled up inside me. My home was slowly transforming into her preferred daytime escape. Trying to retain my composure, I addressed her, "Mrs. Holland, I need to focus on some work today," hoping my tone conveyed both firmness and politeness. She raised an eyebrow, her response dripping with condescension. "Oh, don't fuss about those little stories now. I need my relaxation. Plus, popping over here saves me quite a bit on my utility bills, you know." Her sheer nerve left me momentarily speechless. The situation escalated when she headed to the kitchen. "What's for lunch, Jessica?" "I'm quite hungry," she declared, as she began rummaging through my refrigerator. I trailed behind her, my irritation mounting. "Actually, Mrs. Holland, I haven't gotten around to making lunch yet. I plan to eat later," I informed her. Unperturbed, she shrugged and started pulling ingredients from the shelves. "That's fine. I'll make do. But you really should consider keeping your pantry better stocked, she remarked casually. There I stood, watching her dominate my kitchen and deplete my groceries. The intrusion was glaringly apparent. At that moment, Henry came home for lunch and was surprised to see his mother. "Mom, what brings you here?" he inquired, clearly caught off guard. "Just a little visit. Jessica and I are spending a delightful day together," she fibbed smoothly. I shot Henry a look, hoping he might intervene. Instead, he just shrugged and joined his mother in front of the TV, clearly choosing to remain neutral. Later, the setting sun cast a warm glow into my small home office, filled with fantasy novels and my writing. The coziness of the room contrasted sharply with my current frustrations. Abruptly, Mrs. Holland stormed in, her expression a mix of annoyance and scorn. "Jessica, why are you holed up in here? You act as if you're wedded to your computer. There's an entire world outside these walls," she criticized harshly. Pausing my work, I tried to maintain my calm. "Mrs. Holland, I'm working. This is my profession, my career," I explained. She scoffed loudly. "A profession? Sitting all day, conjuring up fairy tales? That's hard work. It's utter nonsense. Get a real job. Do something meaningful." Her words were cut, each one landing sharply. Before I could muster a rebuttal, Henry appeared, his face mirroring his mother's disapproval. "What's going on here?" he asked, leaning casually against a frame. Mrs. Holland gestured dismissively toward my computer. "Your wife thinks she's contributing to the world with these fanciful tales," she remarked. Henry looked at me, his eyes cold and judgmental. "Jessica, Mom has a point. This isn't really a job. When will you leave these fantasies behind and engage in something truly valuable?" A knot tightened in my stomach. "Henry, what I do is valuable. I am a writer. My work is recognized internationally," I asserted. He chuckled dismissively. "Internationally? Come on, don't exaggerate. How much do you even earn from these so-called books?" It's laughable. Fighting back frustration, I stood my ground. My writing is impactful. It's not merely about the earnings. Henry shook his head, pity etched on his face. "Jessica, passion doesn't pay the bills. It's high time you got a real job, one with a steady paycheck." Their conversation spiraled, each iteration slicing deeper, suffocating me with its intensity. My dreams seemed trivial under their relentless scrutiny. "I don't need to justify my career choices to anyone," I declared, standing my ground. Henry arched an eyebrow. "Defensive, classic. When you can't handle the truth, you run." I swallowed the sharp retort on my tongue, knowing it would only stoke their fire. Mrs. Holland, seizing on my moment of defeat, delivered her final blow. "Think about it, Jessica. We're only saying this for your good. Someday, you'll thank us when you're living in the real world." With those words, they left, abandoning me in my office surrounded by my books, my sanctuary, their harsh words echoing around me, a painful reminder of their misunderstanding and lack of respect. How much longer could I endure this environment, where my aspirations were merely a source of mockery? The future, once radiant with potential, now felt bleak and uncertain. It was a typical Saturday morning, one that normally promised relaxation. Yet for me, it marked the beginning of another dreaded weekend ritual. No sooner had the clock struck 9 than Marin, Henry's sister, arrived, her 3 energetic kids in tow. "Hey, Jessica. Hope we're not too early," Marin chimed as she entered, the children scattering through the house. "No, not at all. Good morning, everyone," I replied, masking my dismay with a smile. Marin, unaware of my discomfort, flopped onto the sofa. "Phew, what a week. I'm beat. These kids have driven me up the wall. Thank God for Saturdays, right?" I nodded, resignation settling in.
"Right.
"Would you like some coffee?" "That would be great. Thanks," she said, already distracted by her phone. Navigating a minefield of toys, I made my way to the kitchen. I felt more like a nanny and housekeeper than a host. When I returned with the coffee, the living room had descended into chaos. "Oh, Jessica, could you whip up some of your pancakes? The kids are starving." It wasn't a request, but an expectation. Sure, I'll get started, I said, my plans for a peaceful weekend evaporating. The kitchen turned into my battleground as I managed pancakes, coffee, and the chaos of kids. Amidst the flipping and serving, Henry walked in, his brow furrowed. Jessica, why do you always buy these expensive ingredients? We need to cut down on expenses, he grumbled, eyeing the breakfast spread. I sighed, frustration simmering. Henry, your sister, and her kids eat here every weekend. It adds up. He shrugged, dismissive. Well, they're family. You can make do with less fancy stuff to save some money. The rest of the day blurred into a cycle of cooking, cleaning, and catering to endless demands. By the time Marin corralled her children out the door, I was physically and emotionally drained. As I slumped onto the couch, Henry approached with a frown. You have to save some money on my nephews and my sister, he said. Incredulous. I stared at him. Me? You're the one who never says no to her. Henry dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. I'm just trying to help you budget better, Jessica. It wouldn't hurt to be more economical, The irony was almost comical. There I was, orchestrating a makeshift weekend childcare and cafe, and yet he dared to preach frugality to me. The urge to yell, to make him see the inequity of it all, was overwhelming, but experience taught me that my words would be wasted. Once everyone finally left, and the house fell silent, that precious tranquility became mine alone. This was the sacred time I reserved for my writing, the few uninterrupted hours to pursue my passion. Just past midnight, I sat down in my study, the dim light of my monitor the only illumination, as I dove deep into the narrative worlds I crafted. Suddenly, the door creaked. Henry appeared, his face clouded with annoyance and exhaustion. Jessica, are you still up? Think of the electricity bill. I took a deep breath to calm myself. Henry, night is the only time I get to write. You know how busy our days are. He stood there, arms folded, his tone becoming harsher. Busy? Do you call taking care of your family busy? That's your duty, Jessica. This night owl routine isn't just impractical, it's costly. Consider our expenses for once. I couldn't hide my disbelief. Really, Henry? We're talking about expenses now. Not the fact that I'm giving up sleep and my well-being to keep my career alive. He scoffed. Career? That little side project of yours? Be realistic, Jessica. Prioritize properly. Frustration surged within me. This side project is more than just a hobby, Henry. It's my work, my passion. Why can't you see that? He shook his head dismissively. What I see is money wasted and a wife distracted by dreams instead of her family. His words stung fiercely. Standing up to face him directly, I asserted, writing is part of who I am. It's essential to me, and I won't just drop it because you deem it inconvenient. He snorted. Inconvenient? It's downright futile, a drain on our resources, and completely unproductive. The sting of his words was sharp, almost physical. I am productive, Henry. Just not in the way you want me to be. Why is that so hard for you to understand? He shrugged coldly, his indifference palpable. Maybe I'd see it your way if it actually made money. Until then, it's just a bothersome hobby. With that, he left, leaving me alone with my thoughts in the softly lit room, my vision blurred by tears. Struggling to keep my dream afloat felt lonelier than ever, especially without the support of the one person who should have stood by me. In the kitchen, the next day, tension filled the air. I was mid-stir when Henry walked in, his mother in tow, casting a shadow that felt almost literal. Marin and her husband need us to watch their kids for 3 weeks, he declared, the finality in his voice brooking no argument. I stopped stirring, shock freezing me for a moment. 3 weeks? Henry, that's a massive imposition. Mrs. Holland cut in sharply. It's family, Jessica. You don't turn away family. My frustration mounted as I thought of my deadlines. But my writing, I have commitments. I can't just drop everything to babysit. Henry's sarcasm was biting. You're writing? Please, Jessica. It's not as if you're crafting a masterpiece. Family always comes first. Desperate for any ally, I turned to Mrs. Holland, hoping for some support. Perhaps the children could stay with you for a bit? She recoiled as if I'd suggested the unthinkable. Me? Look after 3 young children at my age? Absolutely not. I had spent years dedicated to raising our kids, and the idea of needing another solution briefly crossed my mind, perhaps hiring a nanny just for a couple of weeks. When I suggested this, both of them stared as if I had sprouted an extra head. Mrs. Holland, with a dismissive tone, retorted, "Why squander money on that when you're already here?" Henry agreed, nodding. "Exactly, Jessica. We don't have endless cash. You need to think practically." I was stunned. Practical? You're asking me to sacrifice 3 weeks of my life, my work, for nothing, and I'm the one who needs to be practical? Henry's expression turned stern. This isn't up for discussion, Jessica. This is what families do for each other. Aren't you a part of this family anymore? A wave of anger washed over me. No, Henry, I haven't forgotten, but it seems you've forgotten that I have my own life and commitments. Mrs. Holland scoffed. Commitments? Those silly little writings? Don't overreact. It's just 3 weeks of babysitting. My voice rose in frustration. It's not just babysitting. It's about my time, my career. Why can't either of you see that? Henry's look grew icy. Because, Jessica, in the real world, people don't just chase fantasies. They make sacrifices. They do what's necessary for their family. Shaking with irritation, I countered. And what about what's necessary for me? Do my dreams and goals not matter to you at all? He leaned closer, his tone threatening. If you don't do this, Jessica, it's over. I'll file for divorce. Is that what you want? His words struck me like a slap, the threat of divorce looming like a dark cloud. The day the kids arrived felt like the calm before the storm. I watched from the window as Marin's car pulled up, her lively trio spilling out. Mrs. Holland greeted them warmly, the doting grandmother. It would have been almost funny if it weren't for what I had in mind. Jessica, darling, could you help with the kids? Mrs. Holland's voice oozed fake sweetness. I forced a smile, masking my brewing plan. Of course, I'll be right there. Stepping into the living room, I found chaos already unleashed, the kids running wild, Mrs. Holland struggling to maintain control. Finally, Jessica, I thought you'd never come, she snapped, her pleasant mask fading. Henry entered a mix of annoyance and relief on his face. Jessica, make sure they don't wreck the place. I'm going to be in my office. I nodded, heart pounding with anticipation. Actually, I need to step out for a bit. I'll be back soon. Henry scowled. Go out now? Are you kidding me, Jessica? You can't leave us with all this. I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. It's just for a bit, Henry. I need to pick up some groceries. You'll manage, won't you? Mrs. Holland glared. You're being completely irresponsible, Jessica. This is not the time for your little shopping trips. Ignoring her, I grabbed my purse. I won't be long. Keep an eye on the kids. I couldn't suppress a laugh as I closed the door behind me, their astonished faces etched in my mind. I didn't head for the store. Instead, I made my way straight to the apartment. Several days before relocating, I arranged everything and moved into my new apartment when the place was vacant. It felt like my sanctuary, a fresh beginning. As I settled into the sparse surroundings, a sense of relief washed over me. The laughter and newfound freedom were invigorating. I was breaking away from their stifling influence. I knew Henry would soon discover the divorce papers I left behind in my office. Imagining his surprise and anger gave me a twisted sense of pleasure. I had reclaimed my life. Calls and messages poured in from Henry, Mrs. Holland, and even Marin, but I dismissed them. I was finished dealing with their drama and self-centeredness. That evening, as I lay in my new bed, the quiet was a welcome change from the turmoil I had left behind. I reveled in the thought of Henry and Mrs. Holland being overwhelmed by the kids. Now, it was their turn to feel the pressure. The fallout from my departure was more intense than any plot twist in my novels. Friends eagerly relayed the chaos at my old home. One evening, my phone displayed Henry's number, and I could hear the pandemonium in the background. Jessica, you have to come back. These kids are unbearable, Henry pleaded, his voice edged with desperation. I smirked, savoring his distress. Really, Henry? Sounds like you're enjoying yourself, I teased. This isn't funny, Jessica. My mom is at her wit's end, and I can't do this alone, he continued. I relaxed further into my chair, enjoying my moment of vengeance. Well, Henry, you should have considered that earlier. I'm not coming back to be your caretaker, I replied coolly. After a brief pause, he apologized, a rarity from him, but it did little to sway me. Sorry doesn't change the past, Henry. I warned you, I said firmly and hung up, silencing his further objections. Though the satisfaction was fleeting, it soon gave way to a profound sense of peace and liberation. A few days later, I met Katie for coffee. So, I heard Mrs. Holland called Marin, demanding she come back early to take care of the kids, Katie mentioned with a hint of mischief. I chuckled, sipping my coffee. Yeah, Marin stood her ground and insisted on her break. Can you imagine the drama unfolding there? Katie laughed. And your book, it's a sensation, Jessica. It's all anyone can talk about. Pride swelled within me. I had poured my soul into it, and it was my finest work to date. Leaning in, Katie lowered her voice. The main antagonist. She resembles your mother-in-law, doesn't she? I raised an eyebrow, a playful smirk dancing on my lips. Does she? I hadn't noticed. Walking back to my apartment later, I reflected on the significant strides I had taken. Leaving Henry and his overbearing family was the best choice I had ever made. I was finally prioritizing myself and my dreams. My latest novel was just the beginning. The villain, inspired subtly by Mrs. Holland, had resonated with readers immediately. My friends saw the likeness straight away, but for me, it represented more than just a resemblance. It was a therapeutic release, a way to conclude a painful chapter in my life.